The one number which will horrify Australian children. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. Hello, John.
Hello, sir.
Well, back to economics today and big numbers.
Yes. I had the opportunity about a week and a half ago to present at my first seminar for 2021, and there was one number that I presented that shocked the audience, and that number is what we're going to talk about today, because not only is it shocking for our viewers who are adults, but for my children and for the children across the country, what we're about to go through is horrifying, I would say. And in the case of my children, I think their financial futures have been completely ruined.
And this is the point, isn't it? Because the debt is big, but the tail is very, very long. And that's the problem. It's actually an intergenerational problem.
I've now come out and said, well, we have a third debt bubble as a result of COVID-19, and that is public sector debt. And the number that I presented was how much additional debt have Australia's 9 governments, so the federal government, the 6 states, the 2 territories, how much have they accumulated as a result of COVID-19? From what I can tell, no one has really sort of looked at the numbers and actually come to some sort of thinking as to, well, how much is that debt and what are the implications for the economy, but also for both current and intergenerational sort of implications.
And it's very important people understand that, because there's often these little pockets of debt down at the state level, and then there's a big pocket of debt at the federal level. But of course, quite often they only talk about the current flow of debt rather than the accumulated stock of debt, right?
Yes.
And so what we're doing is basically pulling all of those stocks together and thinking about the quantum of that number. Remember, that debt has to be paid back at some point.
This number I'm presenting is from July 2019, so the beginning of the financial year before COVID, through to June 2024. And the reason why we've picked that time frame, which is effectively 5 financial years, is that's what the budget numbers for all of the various governments have projected to. And what I've calculated is that once you add the additional debt, so we're not talking about the total number of total debt, we're just talking about how much additional debt has been accumulated by these 9 governments. The number is $975.8 billion. So almost $1 trillion in response to COVID-19. And one of the big points that I made to this audience I presented to in Adelaide was that what was the purpose of accumulating this debt? It was, in effect, to save the banks. Because we know from the Irish experience, if you have a sharp rise in unemployment, which was the lockdown implication, you will see a massive increase in delinquencies and defaults. And if you have a critical mass of defaults, that's when the financial system becomes in peril on a systemic basis. And that's when you're going to see a complete meltdown of the debt bubble, a meltdown of the banks, a meltdown of the property sector, so obviously they thought that they needed to respond to COVID-19 in an aggressive fashion, and we've already sort of spoken on previous episodes that the response was not, in my view, not commensurate to the public sector risk, or sort of to the risk of public health. But the reason for the stimulus. And so this is one of the key points I continued to hammer home in my seminar, was it was not to save the Australian people, it was to save the banks. And we know that with this Prime Minister in particular, he is joined at the hip with the big 4 banks, and this was all about saving their bacon, and it's come to the tune of almost $1 trillion over 5 financial years.
Yeah, and of course, over there in RBA land, there's another 95 billion that's being pushed to the bank through the TFF, right?
Yes.
Another 95 billion to go until the end of June when it ends. So in addition to this debt pool, there are other things they did too to protect the banks.
Of course, yes. So what we're just talking about is effectively fiscal policy,
Yep.
but there was a whole host of measures around monetary policy that the RBA and APRA and other institutions implemented as well.
Yep. Right, and the debt would obviously be things like the government issuing bonds and those sorts of things, right? And borrowing from overseas, all of those things.
Yes. Well, yes. So obviously the question is who's the lender to these various governments. So yes, there are domestic banks, there are domestic insurance companies, superannuation, obviously for overseas investors, and perhaps a conversation for a different show. But if you look at the breakdown of the foreign debt in the last 12 months alone. So remember, this is numbers over 5 financial years, but the last 12 months there has been a substantial increase in the public sector contribution to the foreign debt. So governments have borrowed, I think from memory, about $134 billion from overseas investors. And on top of all of that, whatever shortfall there was, it was made up by the Reserve Bank of Australia by basically printing money out of nothing and doing QE.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got this big wodge of debt, which nobody's really across or sensitive to or aware of. Frydenberg this last week just said, well, we need to actually let the unemployment rate drop to much lower. In other words, he's going to do more of it. So in this budget, you would expect bigger debt.
Yes. We'll have to see what happens in terms of the upcoming federal budget. But obviously there is a view that imposing austerity or imposing cuts, one from an economic point of view, but particularly as we head to the next federal election, that is bad, both economics and politics. Dare I say, it's more of a political calculation than it is an economic calculation. And the question is, well, how big will this debt burden be by the time we get to June 2024? Because we have a projected number based on the numbers that have been published. But if everyone says, well, we can't have austerity and the economy doesn't recover as expected, one could expect that this number is going to be well north of $1 trillion.
And there's another trap for the unwary here, and that is that the interest rates are very, very low at the moment, right? The interesting question is, how low will they be in 3, 4, 5 years' time? Because, of course, if rates start going up, then the cost of the debt, particularly as you roll it, is going to go up.
Yes.
Which means that essentially we could be not only burdened with trying to make those repayments, but we're trying to actually service the debt at a higher interest rate.
Indeed. Now, one important point to make is last year we had a number of economists, including Chris Richardson from Deloitte Access Economics, come out and say that no need to worry about this debt because we had a bigger deficit, we had bigger debt, public sector debt, after World War II, and we were able to grow ourselves out of it. And now we did a show last October where we actually went through the key factors that led to that outcome in the 25 years after World War II. And my conclusion on that episode was that we cannot replicate because there was a number of unique things in terms of population growth and a whole host of other factors. So if anyone hears over the next month, particularly after the federal government budget is released, don't worry, we're going to grow ourselves out of it like we did after World War II. That is completely a fraudulent and bogus argument. And I think we have some really big problems that as a community, we need to start thinking about. Because if we allow these politicians to continue to run public sector finances into the ground, not only are we going to have Ireland, in the case of, for example, the household debt bubble becoming an issue, we could also see a situation like Greece in 2012. And in modern economic history, I don't think we've seen a combination of households being in some sort of systemic crisis as at the same time that the government is in a systemic crisis as well. So anytime there's, for example, when Ireland was in trouble, when America was in trouble with their housing markets, they basically used the balance sheet of their governments to basically get them out of trouble. Well, we're racking up so much debt that if we had some sort of situation, I don't think we have a lot of ammunition left. And then the question is, well, where do we go from there?